Good morning, good morning, good morning, and welcome to Daring Dialogues. Good morning, good morning, good morning. I hope everybody is having a great and wonderful morning. I hope that all is well in the lives of everyone. I hope that your morning has started off well. And I've got my OJ here, so I can stay a little bit vocally lubricated. And I've got my ice here. And I hope that you're able to grab something. I know some of you, this may be your brunch time or going into your lunch time. So I hope that you're able to grab something this morning as we get into our topic for today. Last Tuesday, we started this topic, and we are going to continue for I think one or two more Tuesdays talking about this book. But the title of the book is Getting Serious About Getting Married, Rethinking the Gift of Singleness. And last time we talked about the history of marriage. We talked about culturally what marriage used to be seen as. We talked about how the church has changed somewhat in their directives on marriage, and how much or how little marriage has been promoted. We talked about how past cultures shamed people who were single, and we know that God doesn't shame anybody. We talked about there was a right time to get married according to the scriptures that she pointed out, talking about the wife of your youth. And then we talked about how marriage was considered a cultural duty in some respects to be able to procreate and be able to further your ethnicity or your ethnic group based on growing the population through marriage. So I do want to say happy Love Day to those who are joining us. We don't necessarily do Valentine's Day. We just believe in love and the celebration of love, and especially the agape kind, because we believe that love is something that should be celebrated every day, especially within the context of marriage. I want to say good morning to pastors and elders who may be on today. I want to say good morning to my husband, my love of my life. And so we're getting back into this book here. And as I said before, when we started out reading it, she was writing about this subject 10 years ago. And this lady, Debbie Macon, her background is, she's ethnicity-wise, she's from India. And she got a lot of flack. She got a lot of pushback on some of the things that she was saying in the book. And like I said, you know, I don't necessarily agree with all of her assessments, but this particular thing she began to talk about, I find it ironic that here it is a decade later, and now people are saying some of the same things that they were criticizing her over a decade before. And one of the things she talks about that we're going to look at today is she talks about one of the causes of what she says is protracted singleness, or singleness that just seems to go on and on and on, is the lack of male leadership in this area. In other words, you have people who are not necessarily stepping up to the plate, but then you also have a gap, rather, in male leadership where even men are not really being pushed and encouraged to marry. And so again, she was talking about this 10 years ago, and now I don't know if you recognize it, but there is a push for men's organizations. There's a push for men's groups. There's a push for men's ministry to really begin to tackle the areas of manhood, right? And part of that manhood, taking it on, part of dealing with manhood is encouraging men to be men of integrity, encouraging men to marry and bear children. Okay? So again, she was talking about these things a decade ago, but she got lots and lots of pushback, probably because a lot of these scholars felt like well, who is she as a woman to be talking about this, or who is she as a woman to be telling us what we should be focused on in order to increase marriages and increase healthy family relationships? So she talks about the bogey of feminism, and she says the argument against feminism goes like this, and she's talking about in the realm of male leadership. She says feminists produced easy sex and therefore marriages aren't happening now. So she said some of the blame came in the culture in regards to feminism, and because of the sexual revolution, women threw off, in the 60s, they were talking about how women threw off sexual restraint during that time. And so it made it easier to have this culture of non-marriage, right? Where everybody was just getting with everybody, and it was the whole flower power, flower child, no responsibility atmosphere. Also, that was also introduced during that time was birth control, right? And then she says here, almost 50 years ago, C.S. Lewis remarked on the plight of the late 20th century woman. C.S. Lewis was a Christian writer. He said, a society in which conjugal infidelity is tolerated must always be, in the long run, a society averse to women. Women, whatever a few male songs and satires may say to the contrary, are more naturally monogamous than men. It is a biological necessity. Where promiscuity in general society prevails, there will therefore always be more often the victims than the culprits. Also, domestic happiness is more necessary to them than to us, and the quality by which they most easily hold a man, their beauty, decreases every year after they have come to maturity, but this does not necessarily happen to a man. Thus, in the ruthless war of promiscuity, women are at a double disadvantage. They play for high stakes and are also more likely to lose. I have no sympathy with moralists who frown on the increasing crudity of female provocativeness. These signs of desperate competition fill me with pity. And so one of the things that C.S. Lewis there was saying is that even if you have this happening in society back in this day, where women felt like we want to have an equal dating or equal competition or equality in the fact that, hey, if men can be single and be promiscuous, etc., then we can do it too. What C.S. Lewis is pointing out here is women by nature are at a double disadvantage. Should you choose to go that route, you're going to lose, and you're at a double disadvantage for trying to take on that mindset. Now, for me, that's not just a male mindset. That's just an ungodly mindset. Not wanting to be or not wanting to have sexual activity within the covenant of marriage is a ungodly mindset. It's not just a male mindset or a female mindset. But what he's saying here is that it sets women up particularly for failure because of the nature of women and how women are built. Women want to be in relationship. Women are nurturers. That is our nature. And so when you pull us away from our nature, there's going to be consequences in a woman that you would necessarily see in a man. All right. So that's one point of view. All right. The next part she talks about is education and independence. So we're talking about areas that affect protracted singleness. One of them was feminism. The second she talks about here is education and independence. All right. In Western culture, we often equate a woman's lack of economic need to be married to a desire of not wanting to be married. There is an unspoken axiom that if a woman pursues a high-level, fairly sophisticated degree, that she somehow has shot herself in the foot and now deserves to be single. Inwardly, we want women to be punished for getting a higher education and having their acts together. I've heard people in the church say that when women take the lead, men retreat, pointing to Genesis and the actions of Eve. But we have it backwards, she says. When men sit in silence and forego leadership, women start doing things. Adam was in the garden with Eve, had been given headship over her, watched the entire conversation with the serpent, yet did nothing. No intervention, no stop talking with that animal. It's like he sat back, propped open a can of drink, and then when everything went to pot, complained that the woman you gave me is at fault. Education is hardly the same thing as taking over the headship of a man. In Asian cultures, women have far more scientific and technical degrees than their white American counterparts. Yet in the old Orient, not under commercial Western influences, or in India, these women are not suffering protracted singleness. Instead, their degrees make them more viable candidates in formal marriage searches. Education is an asset in those cultures and is treated as such. It is only in this country, she's talking about the United States, that Asians also suffer belated marriage making and in fact marry on average a bit later than their white collegiate counterparts. This supports my point that our Western culture and our mating structure, not educated women, are hostile to marriage. In the church and in culture, we think a woman's advanced degree implicitly tells men to retreat, and therefore she deserves to be single. We mistakenly think that if a woman has her affairs in order, she is sending off signs of independence. We vilify her instead of complimenting her for being industrious and intelligent. Now she's talking about the culture of the United States, right? And of course that is kind of pushed through music, that's pushed through movies, that's pushed through media, that a woman that has her stuff together is what? Independent, she's unapproachable, etc., etc. So this is something that she's pointing out, that in American culture, a woman who has her stuff together many times is portrayed as someone who is independent, who doesn't need a man, who's standoffish, etc. In other cultures, she points out clearly that a woman who has her stuff together is actually seen as a benefit to the relationship. So I want you to think about that, and think about how many times in our culture, in our society, have you seen that stereotype, right? That a woman who has her own car or has her own job or has her own home, or is in a high ranking position in society, that she doesn't want to be married, or that she's wanting happily single and does not want a relationship. A lot of times that image is pushed into us in our society, but she wants people to think about and take another look at that just because a woman is industrious and just because a woman is intelligent doesn't mean that she doesn't want to be in a relationship. And I totally agree. So if you happen to agree with that, you can put some hearts on the screen. Just because women now have careers in virtually every field does not mean they want the independence of being single. Women often have no choice but to prepare themselves to be market competitors because they cannot rely upon men to marry them, or for that matter to stay married to them. Now that is an important point. Listen to what she says again. Women often have no choice but to prepare themselves to be market competitors. That means to be able to provide for yourself, because in the culture that we live in, they cannot rely upon men to marry them. And for that matter, they cannot rely upon men to stay married to them. And she's talking overall in general. Okay? Most men interviewed on this subject today say they prefer independent women who can carry their own weight. Men in general do not want women to be dependent. The social science research in this area shows that men expect women they date to be economically independent and to be able to take care of themselves. Yes, Christian women want to marry. This proves that women are not leaving suitors in a haze due to an obsessive career development goal. Most men today want a pay your own way type of deal where the mantle of adult responsibilities of assuming the care of another is avoided and their personal autonomy remains unchecked. This allows many men to keep jobs that resemble hobbies and maintain hobbies as costly as their jobs. The convenient scapegoat of feminism obscures the discussion of leadership and accountability. So one of the things she's saying, the trends that are happening in our culture based on research, is that if a man comes into the relationship and says, you know, I want this woman to be independent, some of the underlying reason for that, she's saying, is that based on research, men want to be able to keep lower paying jobs, which doesn't necessarily allow them to provide overall for a family. So I'm gonna just put a plug right there. Or men want to maintain hobbies that are as costly as their jobs. Now, I don't know about you all, but I have heard lots of complaint surrounding men who are, as she calls it, living their second childhood in marriage. Meaning they spend more time at hobbies and extracurricular activities as opposed to caring for and nurturing their marriage. Whether that hobby is football, whether that hobby is video game playing, whatever it is, you add that scenario of the hobby plus a low-paying job that's not providing or caring for the overall family, and you're going to have frustration in a marriage. That's the bottom line. Because why? Going back to the Genesis mandate, God gave the mandate to protect and provide to Adam. So even though she could protect and provide, when you start switching creation roles, you're going to have a problem. Yeah, that's good, Bespoke. One hand can't clap, but it takes both hands to come together. All right. Here's another one that she's talking about that becomes a reason for protracted singleness. This is what she's talking about. Why are people in their 40s, their 50s, their 60s still single? This is what she's talking about. Now she calls this section the perennial student. And I know some perennial students. These are people who are always getting an education and they never leave the education piece of their life to actually complete it and go on to maturity from education. In other words, they become lifelong students. I'm not talking about people who are married who went back to school. I'm talking about people who have been in school for 8, 10, 12, 16 years. They're just still in school. So let me make that clear. I'm not talking about people who go back and get their master's or who go back and get their doctorate or who are married and in a family and they're in school part-time. That's not what she's talking about. All right? Listen. She says, my husband had a longtime friend who, despite his stellar accomplishments in high school, decided to pursue his first leg of higher education at a local community college. Somewhere along the way, he dropped out and got a full-time job and decided to finish a degree at a technical trade school. Every semester for 3 years, we would check up on his friend, and it always seemed he was 3 credits or 1 class up shy of graduating. Finally, unbeknownst to him, the school credited a class and informed him that he was graduating. He was almost 30. He was beside himself, not with happiness, but with the fear of what to do next. All this time, my husband and I had been encouraging him to find a wife and to get married. He told us that he wanted to continue his education by applying for another degree, this time in philosophy. We responded with disbelief and told him that if he wanted to learn philosophy, he could always read a book. Another 4 years of formal learning would do nothing for his computer career, and would have marginal, if not negative, value in preparing him for marriage. He said he was confident that if he pursued additional schooling, his future wife would understand that he needed to do it for his own personal growth, and that his extra learning would be great benefit to his future family and even future Sunday school pupils. I warned him that women might not be as understanding as he had hoped. Many single women would view him as inefficient and irresponsible, an expert at squandering his time and delaying marriage for himself and another. After all, it would be one thing if he had started off with the intention of studying philosophy and finished up by the time he was 22 or 24 with a master's degree even. But he would hardly command respect by switching horses late in life to pursue yet another avenue of personal interest. This story is not unique. Another young man, after 4 years of college, 3 more in law school, and a series of short-term quasi-legal jobs, decided that he was really interested in learning history. He asked his girlfriend if she would accompany him to the University of Virginia, where the two could get married and she could continue practicing law, so they would have resources for him to pursue a master's degree and then a doctorate in history. They were both in their late 20s, and she told him he didn't have the luxury of pursuing indefinite schooling on her time and her dime. It would be one thing, she said, if they were 18 or 20, and she agreed to support him so they could start a family by their mid-20s. But it was just too late in life for him to ask for that kind of sacrifice, because she would not only be postponing starting a family until her mid-30s, but she had no guarantee that his fickleness would end after getting yet another 2 more degrees, or what he would eventually take on a real job with real responsibilities. What these stories prove is that men often do not think they have to live up to any realistic timetable in which they present themselves as marriage ready, right? Because we always are getting on women, and we dug into that last time. We get on women about presenting themselves, right? About being found, about positioning yourself to be found. We get on women about preparing yourself to be marriage ready. But she is asking the question, what about these men on the other side of the fence? And I'm seeing it in real life, so I'm agreeing with her. What about these men on the other side of the fence who are in school indefinitely? They're pursuing a hobby indefinitely. They're living a carefree life indefinitely. And no one is challenging them to take on a real job, to take on real responsibility, so that they too can be marriage ready. Now, thankfully, I do know lots of young men that are doing this. They're taking on jobs. They're preparing themselves. Some of them are doing investments and those kinds of things. They bought a house, and so they are prepping their life to be marriage ready. But as she said, all too often you do run into men who use prolonged schooling as a way to kind of put off the other responsibilities that come with manhood. All right. And so she does admit this. She says, granted, some of this is the result of a defunct public school system that requires people to go through almost 4 years of college before they attain the same level of knowledge that came with a high school diploma almost a generation ago. And because we have an unprecedented number of people entering college, there is a sort of race to the top where people feel the need to pursue an unprecedented number of postgraduate degrees to distinguish themselves from what is now considered average. So part of it is, she's saying, there's also this pressure that you've got to get more and more advanced degrees to be considered not average, or to be considered as having more education than a person coming out of high school, which is